All right, kia ora everybody. It's great to be here today in KickBack, where we've been talking about youth homelessness and the support available to young people in need. It's part of our visits across Auckland today and of course over the last couple of months to really hear from the community, and we're aware that there's a lot of public interest at the moment around issues around youth crime and so on. And I think what we've been doing today is really talking about, rather than talking about how that manifests itself, we've actually been kind of going right to the root cause of some of these issues. So looking at disengaged young people, looking at young people who the system really hasn't served very well. And it's been a great opportunity to speak with some of the groups who work with those at-risk young people to figure out where the gaps in the system are. Why aren't things working the way that they should? So we'll continue to do these visits across Auckland and of course across the country as well. A great opportunity for us to hear people about how government as a whole can do better in serving New Zealanders. Happy to open up for questions.
Mr. Hipkins, so do you think that youth crime is still an issue today? Of course, the coalition government, the rhetoric from the coalition government has been tough on crime. It's still early days in that government, but is it still an issue today?
Yes, of course it's still an issue today, but as we said when we were in government, you've actually got to get to the root causes of the offending. I think if we did a much better job of intervening earlier, we would have far fewer victims from youth offending because there would be less of it. And that was our approach in government. We had some really comprehensive wraparound programs that were really targeting the most at-risk young people, and they were making a difference. Repeat offenders who were given comprehensive wraparound support were far less likely to go on and re-offend, by quite a large margin. And I think what that shows is that, the young people out there, they don't want to be offenders. Ultimately, they'd rather have a more positive future, and it really is incumbent on all of us to make sure they get a more positive future.
And now you were speaking with budgeting services earlier as well. So how does that fit in with what you've heard today, and what are the repercussions of these funding cuts?
I think what we're hearing right the way across the country at the moment is that there's a lot of people really struggling, and our conversations with the budgeting services this morning really reflected that. So there's a bit of a double whammy there. There are more people who are struggling financially because of the cost of living crisis that the country's been experiencing, and the budgeting services who support them are also having their funding cut as well. So it's a real double whammy.
What was budgeting services' message to you today?
I think they would like more stable and secure funding. They are dealing with a huge amount of unmet need at the moment. So they think that, particularly in the current economic climate where we have gone through a cost of living crisis, that they need more support. And I'm very sympathetic to that.
And the Reserve Bank has kept the OCR stable, but has made it clear inflation is coming down. Do you think interest rates are going to start coming down too?
Well, there is all of the forecasts before the election indicated that in the second half of this year we should get back into that 1 to 3% target band. The government's decisions in this year's budget may have pushed that out a little bit. I think the economists certainly were concerned about the government increasing economic stimulus in the form of tax cuts at a time when the Reserve Bank was trying to do the opposite. So the idea that the government and the Reserve Bank have been working against each other won't have helped to speed things up in terms of getting interest rates down again. So today's announcement, I think, I don't think anyone will be surprised by it. I don't think there was too much to read into it at this point. But I think the whole country will be pleased when we see inflation back to that 1 to 3% target band, because it will ease pressure on things like interest rates.
And what do you think? How tough is it for people out there at the moment?
Oh, there's certainly people who are really struggling. And actually some of the families who are struggling the most are bearing the brunt of the tail end of the inflation spike that we've seen, with things like interest rates, with things like insurance, with things like rentals, with things like council rates, all continuing to go up. That's having an effect on their daily budgets.
Mr. Hipkins, would you be able to give maybe 1 or 2 examples of some particular stories you've heard from people?
I'm always really reluctant to share individual stories, more than just beyond sort of the generalisation, because if we do that, then people are reluctant to actually tell us what's going on in their lives, and so I don't want to do that. But I have heard from more families, for example, who are struggling to just make ends meet, and that's a fairly common theme at the moment. We know that some of our young people are really struggling as well, particularly some of our most vulnerable young people are really struggling because of the cost of living, because of issues around housing, and so on. So I think there's a lot of pressure out there in the community at the moment.
And when you say you're struggling to make ends meet, is this, can't afford to put food on the table, can't afford housing?
I think the costs that I just mentioned are the ones that really are squeezing people. So if you're a home owner, things like higher interest rates, so higher mortgage repayments and higher insurance are really making life difficult. If you're a renter, the increase in rents is certainly really biting into your budget. So there are some families after they've paid their rent who are really struggling to pay the rest of their bills, so pay the power bill, to pay for the cost of running the car and transporting the kids around and paying for healthy food. Any other questions?
No.
Yeah.
Just to change to the government's climate strategy, it was 3 pages long. Were you surprised by the length of that?
I think the government are an absolute disgrace when it comes to tackling climate change. They have wound back almost every measure that we had in place that was actually bringing down New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. They have cut $3 billion out of the climate change budget this year. Almost every decision that they have taken since they became the government has actually increased our emissions rather than reduced our emissions. I can't think of one single major announcement that they have made in the time they've been the government that's actually going to do a single thing to reduce New Zealand's emissions. And that's one of the number one things that we have to be focused on if we're really getting serious about tackling climate change. The government is taking us backwards on climate change, and that's not just damaging to New Zealand right here and right now, it's damaging to our international reputation, it's embarrassing us around the world. I don't think Christopher Luxon's going around the world and say, hey everybody, look at New Zealand, we're going backwards on climate change at the moment. But that's what he should be saying if he was being honest.
And it points to the next emissions reduction plan. What are you hoping to see from that?
I think we need to see really concrete action from government that's actually going to reduce our emissions. They've cancelled most of the things that were doing the heavy lifting in terms of reducing our emissions. Cutting $3 billion out of the budget to reduce New Zealand's emissions, I think is pretty embarrassing when they don't have anything to replace that with. If they're going to rely on the emissions trading scheme, they're going to have to do a much, much better job of that than they have been. But they also need to be upfront with New Zealanders about what that means. A higher carbon price through the emissions trading scheme means a higher price every time you fill up the car, means a higher cost of living, and it's not the most effective way of reducing our emissions.
Mr Hipkins, I know you spoke about this earlier today on the radio, but Darlene Tanner, now you believe she should resign, is that correct?
Yeah, Darlene Tanner should have resigned as soon as she stopped being a member of the Green Party. She was elected as a Green List MP. She wasn't elected as an independent MP. As soon as she resigned from the Green Party, she should have resigned from Parliament. That would be the honourable thing to do.
And do you think that she will?
I certainly hope so. She doesn't have a mandate to be an independent member of Parliament. She was elected because she was a member of the Green Party list. She's no longer a member of the Green Party, so she should resign from Parliament.
And if she doesn't resign, do you think the party should invoke the locker jumping legislation?
That's obviously a matter for the Greens, but I think they would be totally justified if they were to do that. That's what the law is designed to do. It's to preserve the proportionality of Parliament and to make sure that the Parliament that people voted for at the last election is the Parliament that they'll continue to get.
And have you spoken with anyone in the Greens, passed this advice on? Or?
No, I mean, ultimately that's a matter for the Greens, yeah.
And just on NATO, while the Prime Minister's there, do you think he should bring up Gaza?
I think the Prime Minister should use... I think the Prime Minister should use the opportunity of being at NATO to condemn the ongoing supply of weapons to Israel, to call for an immediate ceasefire, and to call for a lasting peace. That would be consistent with New Zealand's proud tradition of being independent on these matters. I think the war in Gaza is unjust. There is a huge humanitarian crisis there now as a result of it. It must stop, and I think New Zealand should show leadership. I think the Prime Minister should use his opportunity at NATO to express those views on behalf of New Zealand.
I just want to jump back to climate change. The government reduced the clean car emissions standards yesterday, but announced obviously the climate announcements today. Do you think that reducing the clean car emissions is at odds against what we just announced
I don't think you could call today's announcement really an announcement. It was just 3 pages of platitudes. There's no real action in there that's going to reduce emissions. And actually, if you look at all of the concrete action that they're taking, they're going to increase our emissions. In the last 7 months since this government was elected, we've already seen, for example, the number of vehicles coming across the border, so in new imports of vehicles. We've seen the emissions profile of those vehicles going up significantly because of decisions that this government have taken. The changes to the emissions standards are simply going to exacerbate that problem. We should be driving down our emissions from transport. This government seemed content to drive them up.
And obviously, you've been visiting Wairau with all the floods in the East Coast, and a lot of people on the East Coast are saying that they're not having enough funding to reconstruct those roads. And they say that this plan will help those in flood-prone areas, but it's not it's not going to help them right now.
I think we need to do 2 things very clearly. We need to make sure that we are mitigating climate change. We must tackle the climate crisis. But we also need to invest in adaptation so that those areas that are low-lying, that are prone to flooding, actually get more support, more flood protection, more support for homeowners who are having to rebuild. And the government cut $6 billion out of climate adaptation from this year's budget. We had set aside $6 billion to fund things like flood protection, to fund those vulnerable communities, including, I was in South Dunedin just last week, where we had set aside a lot of funding to help South Dunedin begin the process, because they're a low-lying area that's constantly being flooded. We set aside money to help them begin the process of managed retreat and of adaptation. All gone under this government. Similarly with Wairoa, you're looking at sort of $40 to $50 million to get that community back on its feet. And so far all they've done is provide a token amount to the Mayoral Relief Fund and reprioritise some funding that was supposed to go to other areas that had been affected by Cyclone Gabrielle last year. They're just not taking it seriously, and they should.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Cheers, no problems.